One of the things that does actually connect between the communities is the word Ayuni.
Ayuni means something my grandmother used to say to me, and she'd say it to love it when I did not know what it meant. And it meant you were dearer to me than my own eyes. That's literally what it means. But it also felt like it meant you are my eyes.
Right.
You are my eyes, and it felt like a giving over to me of herself in this world. Like I get to go out and be her eyes in the world. I get to be her everything in the world. I'm a continuation of her.
Only it's about women and it's about the history of the Jewish culture.
Ayuni is a term of endearment passed from grandmother to granddaughter. These are the stories of our Middle Eastern and North African Jewish grandmothers. Hi, I'm Drora Rusi, an American-born Hungarian Jew married to an Israeli-born Yemenite Jew.
Hi, I'm Dalia Arusi Diveroli, and my kids are represented by 4 communities: Yemen, Ashkenaz, Libya, and Italy.
Hi, I'm Sarah Sassoon, and I'm an Australian-born Iraqi Jew. Come explore with us traditions that have traveled through many lands to our hands today.
Hi, welcome to Ayuni. I am very excited about this. We're talking about the stories of our grandmothers. And these are stories that aren't necessarily told, although we'll discuss later on in the season that some are told in song and some are told through poem, but they're not often commonly known, especially those from across the Middle East and North Africa. And they definitely were not written down. So that's what we're here for. We're here to share the stories and share them with you and ask you to share them with us because we want those stories to be out there. So I'm Drora.
I'm Dalia. I'm Sarah.
And we're here to talk. So, Sarah.
Okay, so maybe just to begin, why it's important to me, these stories, and how I began on my journey of exploring my grandmother's stories, interviewing every old woman I see to find out what their lives were like in Iraq. And now I've extended that to all Middle Eastern women because I'm so interested to know what it was like to grow up as a Jewish Middle Eastern woman. And this is because my grandmothers didn't tell me their story. I grew up in a house with Iraqi food and tea and songs and culture and tradition, and even the language Judeo-Arabic. But no one spoke to me in Judeo-Arabic. No one told me what it was like living in Iraq and about. My grandmother never really explained to me what it was like to grow up by Ezra the scribe's shrine at a small village in Al-Uzair on the Tigris River. So as you can hear, there's a lot of stories I've had to unpack over the years as a writer and educator, and that's what I love sharing with everyone. And I'm hoping that as we do these episodes, we'll also hear your stories and we'll be able to complete the puzzle of what a Middle Jewish Eastern woman was, and also what the future holds for Middle Eastern Jewish women, the messages for us to bring up our children.
And just to clarify, you said you didn't grow up with the stories as a child. At what age did you start to get into it?
When I was 17 and I finished school and was going to university, all my friends went on their gap year and I was at university because I listened to my dad. He's like, you have to stay at university, no going anywhere for you. And I used to spend a lot of time with my grandparents. And that's when I became really interested. And I used to spend a lot of time with my grandmother in the kitchen and I'd drive her around everywhere. And I realized there was a story. I didn't know how to ask the questions and collect it the way I wish I did, but that was the beginning of my interest. Then when my children were born, I started making the foods, and because you can't have Pesach without chalek, which is the date syrup. You can't have Rosh Hashanah without apple jam. And I had my children in South Africa because I married a South African, and you can see a whole life story. And they didn't know about chalek, and they didn't know about apple jam. Even the family I married into was Iraq. They didn't make that because half the family was Ashkenazi and they were South Africanized by them, and things get lost. And I realized if I don't do it, who's going to do it? So that began my journey. And as I began writing, I realized, what do I write best about? It's about my Iraqi heritage and the stories that were lost. And that's where I found my voice.
And for those who don't know, Shoam's Bangle, very recommended. But we'll get into that later in the season too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think you said that you kind of had things like infused growing up, but never like a place to ask questions or things like that. And I think I also had certain hints to what my Yemenite side, I'm also half Ashkenazi, but I'm half Yemenite. We lived very far away from my Yemenite family, so it was a little bit more difficult to as you said, even begin asking questions. But I was sort of thrust into this role of the Yemenite in the surroundings that I was. I look it a lot more than I look Ashkenazi. And I realized that, okay, if people are saying this is what I am, maybe I should try to understand what that means. And my grandparents were not sharing basically anything, even when we used to see them in the summers. And I felt like something was missing. But I think the closest connection that I felt to Yemen was through my great-grandmother, who didn't speak Hebrew. And my father would have to translate when we would go visit her. And I would sit there and just be like, this is the epitome of Yemen. And I just didn't know what that was, but I knew that that was it. And I think that some of my siblings didn't get even to meet her, or they didn't have that same interaction with her. But it's definitely coming through the grandmother. The grandmother represents that heritage and the continuation of that heritage for me.
And you went to go learn Arabic because of it, and
yeah, I wanted to try to communicate with her. I realized then that I was studying the wrong Arabic, but that's okay. I still was able to pick up on certain words when we would visit her.
Things we learn along the way. And if you can't tell, I was born Ashkenazi, rather, I should say. And all four of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and their stories, I was the first one to know their stories, because often Holocaust survivors wouldn't tell their stories to the next generation. So I learned about how my grandmothers survived and how they thrived afterwards. And then when I married my Yemenite husband, I realized that their stories are still not being told. And it's important. And like you, I went then beyond the Yemenites, and you have to understand the full story. So I'm excited to be part of this. So thank you for allowing me to, even though a little bit distanced.
And as the mother of a Yemenite,
That's up quite a bit.
And helped infuse the Yemenite culture, even if it wasn't from your home.
That's true.
And that's also an interesting thing about the Middle Eastern Jewish story. It was so sad, it's so long. A lot of the Ashkenazim are the ones who've been doing the research and revived the stories. For example, there's a whole book about Iraqi Jewish women. It's a treasure of a book by Nili Gabay. She sounds Iraqi, but really she's Israeli from a Polish background. And she married an Iraqi. And when she married him, she realized there's so much more to the story of the Iraqi women. She said, they're so strong and powerful within the home. I want to understand them. And she did a whole PhD on Iraqi women and preserved a lot. And that she's Ashkenazi, but we're all part of each other. And maybe that's another message we should share. That when I speak, for example, I'm looking for the Middle Eastern Jewish woman. I think I'm trying to piece together a part that belongs to all Jewish women and that was lost for all of us, because I believe my Ashkenazi education is very good because I went to a Chabad school in Sydney. I was brought up with Europeans. My third grandfather was a Czech Holocaust survivor. So I was infused also with a lot of Ashkenazi, Jewish, European history and culture. And I feel like learning that was so important to complete my education and understanding as a Jew. That now with the Middle Eastern, that's now everyone else's education that we can complete.
Yeah, very much. And when you say Middle Eastern, let's get into some terminology, because we said this is Middle Eastern and North African.
Right.
And I know, Dahlia, some of your research is definitely on North African as well. And one of my books is on North African as well. So we decided not to call it a Mizrahi. We decided not to call it a Sephardi, but rather Middle East and North Africa. So anybody want to jump in?
I mean, I don't know if we'll come ever to a conclusion of what term really represents us, because each person, I think, has a different connection to different terms. And it's funny because Mizrahi is supposed to be uniting, but all the people within that have their own connection to what it means to be Eastern. Mm-hmm. And I would even throw in the mix Arab. There are plenty of people who are totally against being called Arab Jew. And there are people who are saying, no, I'm an Arab Jew and you better identify me as such. And so I think that these terms I can say only from my perspective. I can't necessarily say what other people feel. I don't know if I feel Middle Eastern. I'm not North African, that's for sure. But I just feel like the Arabian Peninsula had its own thing going on. And there are parts of it that do connect me to Arab culture even before it got to Iraq or it got to Morocco. And a lot of people say that Jews were in all of these lands before the Arab conquest, which is true. but Yemen was part of the Arabian Peninsula. So yes, we came from the land of Israel, but we've been among Arabs for quite a while. And I think that there are certain parts of it that do connect me to that term Arab. I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm an Arab Jew for the reasons that I mentioned, that we were there from the land of Israel. We weren't born there or came from there ethnically. So I think it's a confusing... I just think that also the Middle Eastern term has something different, that it didn't get to the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, that maybe Iraqis or other people in the region can call themselves that. But I think that even the Yemenite one is slightly different, which is why basically I'm saying we couldn't give an overarching term to who our grandmothers were.
Right. I mean, MENA, Middle Eastern, North African, encompasses as much as we can in a sense. It's simply, but it's really good to have this discussion where we can really delve into the nuances of what we say when we mean MENA, Mizrahi, when we interchangeably call these names that are so loaded to some people. Our grandmothers didn't know any of these terms.
It's definitely not.
My grandmother would have known herself as a Bavli. That's how the Iraqi Jews call themselves, Bavlim, Babylonians, because they saw themselves as coming with the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE with King Jehoiakim. That way they said they're royalty. They were exiled with a king before the temple was even destroyed. And that's their kind of legacy and their origin story. But at the end of the day, what's really beautiful is also to say that we used to be Judean. And that's where Jewish from. So we all share that, which is really special. But what I do like about playing with terminologies, as you were speaking, I was thinking when I speak to Arabs and we have similar foods and we have similar language, there's something that connects us. So I guess the main thing about terminology is, are we looking for connection? Are we looking for separation? So I would, as a Jew, I don't mind saying I'm a Babylonian Jew, an Iraqi Jew, and I wouldn't even mind saying I'm also partly an Arab Jew, because I have so many Arab influences in Iraqi Jewish culture. I mean, the first novel in Iraq written in Arabic in the modern country of Iraq was written by a Jew. And they helped revive an Arabic in Iraq, the Jews. They're so part of that society. So to take out the Arab within an Iraqi Jew is to take away also a big part of their culture and history. And so if it's a connecting factor, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's something that's true specifically for Iraq, because if we look at North Africa, they weren't really writing in Arabic. They were writing in Judeo-Arabic, in Hebrew letters. And that's, I mean, we're talking about the modern era, but like still, it wasn't, they spoke it, but it wasn't their identity so much that they were reviving the language, which is really true of Iraq. And I think that what you were saying also about connections is part of the reason that Mizrahi came up as a term, to connect between the different communities in Israel that weren't Ashkenazi. And it has power to it to say that we're part of a group that's larger than just our small group. But it comes with other things that we might not like as much about being within a group and just kind of whitewashing the group. There are connections, and then there are also things that could just get lost when you're in a larger group. But as you said, we don't want to be in separate groups so that we disconnect from other people. So yeah, terms are loaded.
It is. And we want to look at the connections with them. But as you said, every group is so different. And I love learning about Yemenite culture, and the Moroccan culture is so different to the Iraqi. Everyone is so individual with their individual songs. And then I also love it when I hear the same song.
I think one of the things that we have to be aware of is, we're talking about grandmothers. So we're talking about people who actually left those countries. And when I talk to some of those people, I often will get a visceral reaction to the word Arab. I'm not Arab. And
It was the Jews and the Arabs.
right.
And even if there were Christians there, Christians was something else, but Arabs was Muslims, and it was the Jews and the Arabs in a lot of instances.
Right. So that's one of the reasons I think that it's just so important here that we're clarifying. And that's why we're not using those terms. And Sephardi obviously is, I mean, just sitting here, Babylonians are not Sephardim in general, and Yemenites are not Sephardim in general. They didn't go through the Iberian Peninsula, even though it's the greater Sephardi world now. I think we're being cautious about those kind of things.
Right. Even though what I really do love as well is the interconnections between the communities. So when the Sephardi Jews, when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, many of them went to Turkey, to Morocco, some even went to Iraq. Like I know there's Fardim who went to Iraq. They adopted the Babylonian culture and customs because that was seen as the original. And that's important to remember. So that we don't, like my grandfather's family, they say they come from a Sephardi origin, one of their ancestors. So really we can be very flexible and also have our boundaries which is important.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that does actually connect between the communities is the word Ayuni, which is what we called our podcast. Ayuni very much connects the communities and it connects us to our grandmothers. So do you want to share a little how you remember the word Ayuni?
Okay, so Ayuni means something my grandmother used to say to me, and she'd say to love it when I did not know what it meant. Mm-hmm. And it meant you were dearer to me than my own eyes. That's literally what it means. But it also felt like it meant you are my eyes. Right. You are my eyes. And it felt like a giving over to me of herself in this world. Like I get to go out and be her eyes in the world. I get to be her everything in the world. I'm a continuation of her. That's how it felt to me.
I absolutely love that, by the way.
Yeah, so I do interpret things very flexibly, I suppose. But that's how it felt as a little girl and as I grew up and understood what it meant more.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the first words, if not the only word, that I consistently understood that my great-grandmother would say. I less remember my grandmother saying it, and I think that has to do with her desire to be more modernized in Israel. And there's something to say to that because she came at a very young age. She came at a time that was very difficult to be a Yemenite Jew in Israel. But I rarely remember her saying it, if ever. And I just remember it through my great-grandmother. And I remember the first time I understood what it was because I took apart the words and as I studied Arabic and I was like, okay, this makes sense. But it also just felt like something so natural that it came out because like this was like, you're my precious. That's how I interpreted it. And everyone, like all of my descendants are precious. So I just refer to everyone as Ayuni. It has this like a special meaning also because it kind of connects to other cultures. Like you say the apple of my eye, like it's not something that's strictly for Arabic. And by the way, it's also something that just Muslim Arabs, Christian Arabs say also to their people who are dear to them. So I think it's also a way of showing our connection to the region. It's a way of showing the connection between the communities. And it's a real connection to our grandmothers who would use that word all the time.
Maybe it's just to add, like when I speak to friends in Baghdad now on social media, and it's actually illegal to speak to me because I live in Israel. It's the death penalty. And we should actually speak about the breakage, why Israel has all the Jews from these Middle Eastern and North African countries. I don't think we really spoke about that. Like, why are we here? That when we speak we share things like Ayuni, when we share things like what our grandmothers did and the similarities in food, that builds such a deep connection that I think grandmothers stand for in general. Yeah. Like there's something feminine about connecting in home that is very welcoming to everyone. And that's the kind of world we want to live in our own lives, in our own homes, but also as societies. So when I think about Baghdad, I feel really sad because the reason my grandparents had to leave Baghdad and 120,000, if not more, Jews had to leave in between 1950 and 52 is because of anti-Semitism and persecution. And so the people I'm speaking to now, their grandparents were the ones who lived in Baghdad with my grandparents. And they could not stop this wave of persecution, anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism, which caused the whole community to leave. Speaking to them now feels like maybe we're healing something a breakage that happened that caused all the Jews to come to Israel to very difficult conditions on so many levels, which we'll speak about as the coming episodes. We also hope, and my hope with this podcast season is to start introducing the dialogue that the Middle Eastern Jews have a lot to offer in terms of healing within the region through our grandmothers.
But healing, there's also those connections, like you were saying. Yeah. You have those connections with Iraqis in Iraq today, Muslim Iraqis. Yeah. And you can maybe address when you went to Saudi Arabia or your college experiences with the Arabs that were there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many points of connection that kind of get lost when you just talk about Israel and Muslim states around. But when you talk about the life that was before in the state of Israel, it didn't have to happen. But because it happened, there was that breakage, as you said. And so most of these communities, the people who are living there now, don't necessarily remember the Jews. They want to know about the Jews because they know maybe that it was part of their culture, but they didn't personally know them. There are some instances like Syria and Lebanon where they did live there until like the 80s. And also my husband has an aunt who lived in Libya until 1983, which is bizarre, which means there are people who do remember some, but most of them don't. And we're trying to rebuild the world so that we can share it with people who don't have memories, like have memories from our grandmothers, and Muslims from those countries can ask their grandparents about it. But like, we're building on other people's memories. They're not our memories.
Right. And we connect to those memories through understanding the food that we eat isn't from Israel, for example. Like, the food I was brought up with was an Australian. And suddenly I realized that there's a whole world that's disappeared for my family, that it still exists. It's in Iraq. And there are people living that world, and there's feeling of being displaced. But the displacement of Jews was also displacement for them. Because in Iraq specifically, I mean, Baghdad used to be a third Jewish in 1917. So the loss of the Jews was the loss of something that was very, like losing a leg. It was like losing a part of Iraq that they still haven't recovered from, and they know it. People know it. People saying, we want our Jews back.
Yeah, there are definitely people, especially in Cairo and across Egypt and Alexandria as well, that talk about the loss of the cosmopolitanism when the Jews were kicked out, along with many other people. But they acknowledged that it was the Jews that were kicked out or made to leave in one way or another. And that was the end of the cosmopolitan. I mean, Cairo was beautiful. Cairo was coffee shops everywhere, people going out to eat, amazing singers, right? Laila Murad. I mean, you have these history, Kulthum. In Morocco, actually, they're trying to gain it back through Mamuna or things like that. With the Mamuna Association is a Muslim organization who's trying to show the deep heritage that the Jews had there because it shaped Morocco.
Right.
It shaped these countries, Libya, Tunisia. It's part of the culture. And we need to, not only, it's about women and it's about the history of the Jewish culture.
Well, what's also interesting is that maybe women held that culture. Because if I think about it, through my grandfather, okay, he had the prayers and songs on Shabbat, but the real Iraq for me is my grandfather's Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
It's the food, it's the smells, it's the Shibani spoke Judeo-Arabic, a bit of Hebrew and a bit of English, so also the language. And I think the women hold the country in a way that's even more visceral, and something that gets passed on more than men, which is an interesting discussion. I don't know what you think.
I think it has to do with also how they held on to it in their origin countries. I mean,
Right.
They held on to, let's say, the Jewish culture. If they were cooking kosher and singing songs that were mixes of Hebrew and their local dialect, then they were holding on to a culture even there. So there's something to the women that they hold on to culture wherever they happen to be, wherever they're going. And so, yeah, I agree, definitely. It could also be that for us as women, we find that our mothers and grandmothers are the ones who hold on to it because, as you said, we're not as active in the synagogue. There might be others who are, and then they do feel that connection through there. But I definitely think there's a connection through the synagogue if you're involved in the practices there, because I can tell you that my husband is very connected to his Italian roots because of the synagogue and because of the holidays and the tunes that he knows from there. But I think he also definitely has a connection through the food. But we as women, where our space is, or where our space isn't always within the synagogue, and then our space is in the home, where even if you want to say that we're beyond the home and we're not always in the kitchen, there's something in the home that draws the woman, and that's how we connect. That's why we also see the heritage there the most, right?
And I think one of the things we're going to explore this season is also even beyond that, because there's the strength of many of these women from Kwas MENA that we don't know because it wasn't written and it wasn't told, but we're starting to uncover some of those stories. I mean, one of the most beautiful things that was in our family was my husband's family came together with about 100 of their first cousins and had a Shabbat Dorot, so it was a family reunion, and they were from all spectrums of religious life. But there was a panel of the sisters, like the grandmothers, the sisters were all sitting there, and some of the stories they told and some of the power you felt of the way they held the family together. And they were all born in Yemen, and when they were young, they were obviously barely allowed to leave the house. And the strength and the impact that they had on these 100 or so people sitting there and beyond, to me, is incredible. And I'm excited to explore it this season. So
I can't wait to hear their stories. I think that's the thing. The power of stories, that it makes it personal, it makes it real, and it makes it relatable. And we're also hoping that our viewers and listeners will share their Middle Eastern stories. And even, I have to say, that Europeans' stories, American stories, anyone who kind of relates to the power of a woman to hold a home together, to carry on generations. Because I know when I've given talks and I've spoken about from Middle Eastern perspective, I really appreciate the feedback and stories I've gotten saying, well, that was similar in England for me with my grandmother, or in Bulgaria. And that just the stories and similarities as well, very interesting. Like silence isn't something new. The Middle Eastern Jewish story is silent, but Holocaust survivors are also silent. And I know someone, when I gave a talk in LA, and she said, I grew up with a photo in my room, and it was of this beautiful woman. I always used to think she was my grandmother. And she gave me so much strength. And when I was older, I found that she wasn't my grandmother. She was just a photo. It was just a photo. It was just like a photo. Don't know who. But she said it didn't matter. That idea of that was my grandmother as a child gave her so much strength. Because there were no photos, because she was from Holocaust survivors. So it's just that idea that we come from somewhere gives a lot of strength.
And so, yeah, I'm excited. Please do share your stories. Please make sure that because this is a conversation. We're opening a conversation. Let's make it.
And we'd like to respond to your stories in every episode. We will be reading one of the stories out and sharing with our viewers and listeners. And we're going to explore, what does it mean to be a woman from this region in North Africa, where their stories are untold, the idea of silence, the idea of food, embroidery, song. And we're going to make this come alive for all of us.
I'm excited.
Yeah, this too. Awesome.
Bye, Ayuni.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Ayuni, Voices of Our Jewish Grandmothers, is brought to you by Jewish Unity Through Diversity in partnership with Sarah Sassoon. Our executive directors are Drora Arusi, Sarah Sassoon, and Dalia Arusi Di Veroli. Our theme music is by Oshrat Chaim. Please rate and review this episode wherever you're listening to the podcast, and don't forget you can also watch on YouTube. And let us remind you that these stories live on when we share them. So please share your stories with us of women who held together families and communities throughout the ages in different lands. Email us at ayunivoices@gmail.com, and we might feature your story on the next episode. Stay tuned.